your assignments in this and other subjects. So I hope you did enjoy yourself though over that period. Great to see the weather improve. A few singlets out. A couple of the guys getting the guns going. That's all right. It's good. Bit of work required there. But generally speaking, everyone's enjoying the weather. That's great. Now, what I want to do before I start is to tell you a little bit about a program that we run. Maybe not for you guys now, or at least for this year, but to think about in coming years. This is an amazing program. It's a program that I run with Professor Jennifer Grafton from accounting, and we usually have help from one or two others. What we do is we work with enthusiastic students over summer and prepare them for to compete in international case study competitions. Many of you, anyone here compete in the BCom case study competition? Anyone? One. Is that it? Only one of you. All right. Well, you know what they're like. They're intensive periods of preparation around a particular case where you work toward a set of recommendations that ultimately you present to a panel of experts, oftentimes members of the top management team of the company that you just analysed. When we go to these international competitions, it's that similar format, but just again a lot higher in standard in terms of competition, also in terms of the depth and detail within the cases. So these are the competitions we go to. We've got one at the University of British Columbia coming up next year, Marshall School at University of Southern California, McGill. We won McGill last year, which is quite exciting. These are difficult competitions to win. Remembering going up against, Wharton, Georgetown's, Berkeley's, Copenhagen Business School, Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, some really good, National University of Singapore, some really, really good schools. And you're going up against the best, if you like. So to walk away from 12 schools to say that we were the best in the world at that particular competition was a really nice thing. And there might be one other we're adding here, the Copenhagen Business School competition, which is probably the best one in the world. We've just been invited back to. So if that sounds like something you'd be interested in doing, I should say that it's a big commitment on your behalf. You've got to commit your summer to it. And by that I mean every weekend we work over summer on these cases and during the week as well. Up until about Christmas, we have Wednesday afternoons, Wednesday evenings, building our skill base for these competitions. It's a huge commitment. But the payoff for you is that we fly you to these competitions. We put you up in the hotels required to compete here in these events. And look, that's the small benefit. The real benefit is the network of friends and fellow students that you build in the process of competing in these events. We've got an amazing alumni group as a result of these competitions, many of whom are already working with companies like McKinsey, Boston, Bain, Deutsche Bank, PwC, KPMG and so on. So there's a fantastic thing. Now, we're going to talk a bit about this afternoon. So if any of you are interested, come along to the Spot Level 1 Lecture Theatre and we'll tell you a little bit more about it. But I'd highly encourage you to think about this. If it's not this year, maybe next year or the year after. They're fantastic. It's a fantastic event. Okay, well, enough of that. Let's continue on where we left off last week, 2 or 3 weeks ago now, where we introduced the idea of the distribution channel, and we made it, I suppose, the single most important observation we can make about distribution channels, and that is that it's the one element of the 4 tools that we have in our marketing toolkit, our 4 Ps. It's the one where we have perhaps the least control. It's the one where we're all of a sudden devolving responsibility to an agent. We're asking another firm, another company, a retailer, a wholesaler, a franchise owner, whatever. We're asking for another business, another person, another group of people to act on our behalf. And with that agency arrangement comes a high degree of risk, a high degree of uncertainty, and indeed a high degree of potential conflict. So in this session I want to touch on this notion of conflict. Where you have an agency relationship, you have the potential for conflict. Now, it's not to say within firms where there's no agency relationship the conflict doesn't occur. Of course it does. In OB next year, organisational behaviour, you'll study that very question in great detail. When does conflict emerge within organisations? But the potential for conflict is so much greater when you're contracting out, when you are asking another business to act on your behalf. At least with conflict inside firms, you can take the person aside and say, well, hang on, I'm paying your wage, you work for us, you're working with this team, think about it, because you may not have a job all that for that much longer. I'm sure we could do it in a much more developmental way than I've just described, but the point is that it's a lot easier to deal with conflict when it arises within the firm than when it arises between firms. So I'll touch on this idea of conflict and we'll talk about some strategies for its management. And then we'll finish with some questions around what determines the structure of channels. And I suppose from that objective, this second objective, the one realisation I think that we'll take away from that is that, well, there isn't any real rule of thumb as to what a channel should look like. There are some things that we can take into consideration, but there's so many factors that we might consider. Is it any wonder that we see channels look very different, very diverse in the markets in which we compete? So that's the two objectives for today's session, or at least the first half of today. Okay, so conflict. How might it emerge? Well, there's this idea that there'll be horizontal conflict. As a firm, we will sell, by definition, to multiple retailers. We'll sell to wholesalers and retailers. We will sell to not just one. When I drew those channel structures, I will have, they look like you're just dealing with one company beneath you. But when I have the level of the retailer, you can be sure that that's multiple retailers. Dozens, hundreds, maybe thousands of retailers. There is always going to be potential for conflict that emerges between members at that level of the channel. Now, partly you could argue, well, this is just competition. Of course, retailers should compete with one another. But oftentimes the conflict emerges because we may treat these retailers differently. We may provide one retailer with exclusive access to one of our products, our high-end products perhaps. And a fellow retailer or retailer down the street, we only provide our baseline offering, our standard set of products. That can lead to conflict. Actually, an ex-girlfriend of mine from many years ago worked for a wine company. And one thing she found was that she was in retail sales, she had a lot of retailers saying to her, why have you given this store down the road special access to your Mildara Blass or your Wolf Blass grey label, and yet we only have one case allocation and they've got 10, or whatever the numbers were. Why are we not able to access that premium brand? Well, it's very difficult. You make an argument about how we're cultivating you as a client, and as you grow, you'll get access to our better products. But clearly what happens is that these retailers at the same level are dissatisfied with the deal that the other one has got. You often see retail conflict at the same level occur where a firm might locate or start selling to another retailer that's too geographically close. retailers like to know that they've got some exclusivity around a particular zone within their geographic zone for their particular lines of products. Some retailers might take a particular product from a given product line and take one of those products and discount aggressively, run with what's known as a loss leader. We'll sell this product at a very low price so that customers will come to my store and buy more of my products. That leads to conflict in retailers down the road who are saying, well, we don't think that's good business. We don't think it's right to discount heavily one particular brand to drive customer traffic and so on. It might even be conflict with an online retailer that's selling at a lot lower price or margins because the physical retailer, has higher costs to operate and can't match those prices. Hewlett-Packard found this out the hard way when they tried to emulate Dell's direct model, online model. Remembering that Dell has never sold Dell computers in stores. They've never started out with a physical retail model. They've always been online and direct to consumers and businesses. HP, on the other hand, had always sold primarily to stores, retailers, your Harvey Normans, JB Hi-Fis and so on. And then when they said, well, we want to do what Dell are doing to capture more margin, let's go direct. Of course, the retailers were very upset with that. There was conflict between the retail arm of HP and the physical retailers, electronics retailer stores themselves. Now, as you can see, a lot of this horizontal conflict is coming about because of what the manufacturer is doing. And in some sense, you could argue that a lot of it is both horizontal, conflict with the retailers at their level, but also conflict with members at different levels of the channel. So, for example, with that last one around HP, yes, technically the retailers of electronics and computer goods were in dispute or in conflict with the direct retailer, HP retailer, but at the end of the day, you could argue that that was an argument they had with their supplier who was moving down the channel to compete with them at the same level. And so we often see vertical conflict where we've got this conflict between different levels of the same channel emerge. And this might be around the kind of support that's given by a manufacturer to a wholesaler or a wholesaler to a retailer. It could be about, again, access to exclusive deals or price points that are made available somewhere else but not to this particular retailer, and so on. So it might be around resources, around information flow, training, price points, and so on. So again, this is largely, or this conflict emerges because you've got essentially different businesses with different sets of objectives and profit motives, clashing with another firm. And it's not as simple as saying, well, don't do that anymore. Because they don't belong to us. They are not our company. So we need to treat them, or at least manage them, a little bit more creatively. Well, how do we do that? We do it fundamentally by organising the channel. Now, conventionally, we have just acknowledged this as a reality, as a fact, that because we are a different organisation from the retailer who's selling our shoes or phones or food products or whatever, because they're different from us, they're acting on their own interests. In a sense, what we have to do is just isolate ourselves from them, maximise our own profits, and hope for the best. What that does, however, is the conflict and the, in a sense, competition that occurs can oftentimes give away surplus, if you like, to consumers at the expense of the channel as a whole. So we don't, in a conventional channel where we just act at arm's length from one another, we don't in a sense, explore opportunities for maximising value in the channel as a whole, for the system as a whole. So we can do that where we treat the channel, in a sense, we take a step back and treat the channel as its own organisation. This is what we mean by a vertical marketing system, is to say, let's step back and say, okay, in the past we've competed, in a sense, with our fellow competitors. We've been antagonistic and adversarial with our wholesalers and our retailers. Our retailers themselves have been adversarial, antagonistic with others at the same level. And as a result, that sort of bloodbath has resulted in one thing: customers doing very, very well out of this, loss leading prices, intense competition, high saturation of products within small geographic zones. Customers do well, but the companies themselves tend to suffer. Yet we know from last lecture that we need retailers. We need members within the channel. Remember our arguments? One of the arguments was an economic argument. It's far more efficient to have a retailer take a product to the market than it is to do it ourselves. Now that's changing a little bit with the online, in a sense, onslaught. But think about it, guys. Online is not killing off traditional retail. Now, you might listen to these recordings in 7 years' time and say, Simon, you got it really, really wrong. But online isn't killing traditional retail. You only have to look around you to see that that's not the case. Remember the data I presented on multi-channel retailing, and the willingness to spend from customers who use multiple channels is so much greater when you have access to multiple channels. Multiple channels works better than one channel alone. So the internet's been around for, what are we now, 16, 17, 18 years, and bricks and mortar retail's still here. I don't think it's going anywhere. The ones that are going anywhere, or disappearing, are the ones who are unwilling or unable to change to compete in a more fluid world of routes to market or channels. And these are the Harvey Normans and others who I don't have any sympathy for. So the vertical marketing system is what we're talking about. Now, what does that mean? What might it look like? Well, one way of doing this is to say, let's just own those various stages of the channel. Let's just own those stages, because then we remove the agency problem, all right? We're not dealing with another company. We're actually dealing with another group or department within our own company. And you see this a bit in, familiar markets to you will, of course, be, Apple is a good one where they've said, forget exclusively going through agents, retailer agents. Let's start our own stores. Let's actually open our own stores. And they've done that to great effect. And a lot of companies now are following that model. Opening their own wholesale channels, their own cash and carry channels, and their own retail outlets themselves. The car companies for a long time have owned a percentage of their dealerships. Probably less so now than historically, but that's happened. McDonald's own, actually increasingly, more and more of their stores. So McDonald's have increased the number of stores that they actually now own, that are corporately run, rather than through a franchise model, as we know, or has been traditional. So at the one end, at one extreme, we can say let's own the various stages of the channel. And of course, when we do that, we align incentives. We bring incentives into line, because we're all working for the one company. Now, I suppose a departure from that, but one that kind of tries to simulate a corporate structure. Because think about this, owning your own retail channel has a number of risks. Number one, it's very expensive. It can't have been cheap for Apple to open, their flagship store on Fifth Avenue in New York, on that corner of Central Park. It can't have been cheap for them to open their other flagship store in Covent Garden in London. You know, probably some of the most expensive real estate on the planet. That can't be cheap. It's not inexpensive. And so that comes with a degree of risk. Further, most people said when Apple decided to do this, Apple, you're not retailers. You don't know how to compete in a retail environment. What are you doing? And there was some merit. I mean, I was probably one who was also sceptical. You know, you're great as a consumer electronics goods manufacturer and provider, but to go to retail, that's a different set of skills. Well, they've been very, very successful in their retail part of their business. But it does carry with it some risks. So in the absence of owning our own retail chains or outfits, we can contract more effectively with those down the chain. So this is not just having a supply agreement with them, literally contracting, literally binding these particular firms, retailers and wholesalers, to us as a company. Now, what does that look like? Well, if we take corporate, we've just talked a bit about corporate as ownership, and then we look to contractual. I'll come back to administrative in a minute, but contractual is probably one of the more common forms of vertical marketing system that we see today. You know, we bring together what we'd call a wholesaler sponsored voluntary chain, and we say, let's bring together a whole number of companies, act in concert with one another, act in agreement with one another. Let's not divert or undercut each other, and let's see what benefits that brings. So when David's, for example, launched the IGA supermarket chain as a wholesaler, David's being a wholesaler of grocery products, what David's were doing was sponsoring IGA supermarkets to say, guys, if we all act in concert, we can build brand value, reputation, loyalty, we can access huge amounts of, we can get better prices when we go to brands, manufacturers of food products and grocery products. We can do a lot better if we act in concert rather than as acting as separate grocery stores, acting independently. Hundreds and hundreds of IGA supermarkets going to Coca-Cola in unison to argue for a better price is much better than each of those 100 or 200 stores calling Coca-Cola themselves to argue for a deal or a better deal. So David's and IGA is a good example there. Now, retailer cooperatives are just a little bit like that, except there's no one wholesaler marshalling the troops. It's really just the retailers themselves getting together without necessarily a wholesaler behind them. And, you know, Mitre 10 stores, do you know the hardware stores? Mitre 10 are a good example of this. They're effectively lots of different small hardware stores. That's all they are. They're hardware stores, independently owned, and a few of them would have got together some years ago now and said, I need to buy a box of hammers every 6 months and I don't really get a great price. What if 60 of us as retailers or in hardware got together and bought a pallet load of hammers? We could do a lot better in terms of price and support and so on. So, you know, these are retailer cooperatives that come together. There's more of these than you think. A lot of these franchise arrangements that we look back and think, well, there must be some corporate behind them, oftentimes are nothing more than just retailer cooperatives. But the one that we do see a lot of is the franchise arrangement. This is quite common, and here we're talking about whether it's manufacturer sponsored. So again, Ford as a manufacturer might will contract with its franchisees who will be exclusive retailers of Ford products. As a manufacturer, Ford support these franchisees. It could be a franchise system that's not retail focused. Coca-Cola, Amatil sponsor or at least franchise out the manufacturing of, or the bottling of their soft drinks. So there are hundreds of bottlers across the country, all of whom are franchised, have a franchise arrangement with Coca-Cola to produce their soft drinks. We don't really see these bottlers because they're not retail focused. We don't see the public face of these companies. They're factories somewhere out in, Broadmeadows or Sunbury or something. We don't see them, but they do exist, and they are a franchise system. And then, of course, the ones we do see, obviously the retail physical goods, but also retail service firms, something like McDonald's, Body Shop and so on. These are franchise arrangements where we have a deal, an arrangement with the manufacturer of the product to sell their products or services exclusively. So this is sort of the big picture about how we can manage conflict, one, by buying out the retailers. And look, as you can see with Apple, they have bought their own retail, but they still have contractual deals. The store in the student union is a franchisee, if you like, or a contractual arrangement with Apple to sell Apple products exclusively. And then we have a third option, which is what's called administrative. And really, this is a kind of a situation where we simulate the corporate structure, we simulate the compliance brought about by contracts just by being big, just by having the weight, the heft, the strength to ensure compliance. So, look, what we're basically arguing is that one member in the channel, irrespective of what stage it is, acts as what we would call a channel captain. Now, Walmart happens to be a retailer, not a manufacturer. We've talked about Ford, McDonald's, Coca-Cola and so on. It can be the case where a retailer or a wholesaler actually behaves as the big hairy gorilla in the channel and says, you will do what I say. Walmart are extremely good at doing this. So they make sure that their suppliers deliver a certain level of quality at a certain price. Strictly controlled and monitored. And compliance is not because there's a contract, although there usually will be a contract of supply, but it's not a franchise agreement, which is very much more complicated. I mean, if you think about I don't know if anyone has anything to do with a McDonald's franchise. No? McDonald's franchise manuals, if you like, their operating manuals, are, like Encyclopedia Britannica. There's a huge amount of information. There's a huge amount of process, of rules, of norms, of routines and so forth to which the retailer or franchisee must comply. It's just phenomenal. It's incredibly, even down to cleaning the toilet. There are certain amounts of times you've got to go around the bowl in an anti-clockwise toilet. I mean, literally, it gets that specified. Not so in an administered system. We're not relying on that level of agreement. We do have contracts. Yes, you'll supply us with 1,000 boxes of this wine next year. But the compliance to quality and price points comes from the threat of Walmart not buying from you next year. So their size ensures compliance. Now, there are very few firms that can do this. You do literally have to be huge for this to be possible. Even Coca-Cola, a large corporate, would struggle to ensure compliance amongst its retailers. Although, to be fair, a lot of the smaller corner stores and so on, if they didn't have that product, would not have a business. Or didn't have Coke products, they wouldn't have a business. And so they can ensure compliance, certainly amongst smaller retailers. But this one does rely on a fact that is very much distinct from these other two, corporate and contractual, is that one member, namely the channel captain, must be big.